Hey guys, Chris from Average Eskate Reviews here, and today in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Vestar or the Vestar Black Hawk, depending on how you want to pronounce the name. I'm going to call it Vestar. But what we're going to be doing in this video is highlighting the difference between this particular board, which is an all-terrain board with a flexi deck, very similar to the Evolve GTR Bamboo, so it's the perfect board to compare this against. Now the GTR Bamboo costs $1,899. And the Vestar Black Hawk costs $1,399. Now the first thing that I always think about when I look at a board, as you guys know, is going to be speed. So as always, I'm going to be splitting the video up into categories to best explain the different points. And one of the most important ones for myself personally is going to be the speed. So when we look at the Vestar Black Hawk, the top speed I was able to get out of it, we were using it with the AT wheels, airless AT wheels, which was 7-inch. Max speed for my build, which is about 75 to 76 kilograms, was 21.1 miles an hour. When we look at the GTR Bamboo, the top speed with the 6-inch setup was between 23 and 24 miles an hour. When we look at that same top speed with the 7-inch wheels, it was around 19 to 20 miles an hour. So the Vestar was a little bit quicker than the GTR Bamboo with the 7-inch wheels, when we talk about the Vestar being with its own 7-inch wheels, which are airless, versus the Bamboo GTR, which has an inner tube, which is definitely an important one to touch on, an important point to mention rather, but I'll go into the ride and how these two different wheel setups feel later on in the video. Now when we look at how the board performs in terms of its top speed as you get through the battery life, as you drop to about 50 to 60% of the board's battery, the Vestar was hitting a speed of roughly between 17 and 18 miles an hour with its 7-inch airless AT wheels. Now the GTR Bamboo with the 6-inch wheels, as you'd expect, was still going a little bit quicker, sort of around the 19 to 20 mile an hour mark. When we look at the 7-inch wheels, again with the GTR Bamboo, which has an inner tube, the speed between the Vestar and the GTR Bamboo was about the same, but I'd definitely say that the Vestar would, if you were on a very, very straight stretch and you were able to go top speed for quite some time, the Vestar would creep ahead of the GTR Bamboo. Now, something that's worth touching on is the fact that the Vestar Black Hawk only has one gearing option for the 7-inch airless AT wheels. But when we look at the Evolve GTR Bamboo, that has essentially two gearing options that you can technically use for the 6-inch and the 7-inch. The 6-inch AT wheel with an inner tube has the 47-tooth gear and also the 66-tooth gear, and the 7-inch AT wheel with the inner tube has the 66 and also the 47. The 47 isn't really suggested to be used with the 7-inch AT wheel by Evolve because you can get motor overheating issues, but it's worth mentioning that there is an option for you to be able to switch between the two. Aside from that, of course, it's important to mention that as Evolve boards go as a whole, third-party manufacturers out there on the internet have endless different variations and options between the toothing and the gearing that you can get for their boards to be able to add to your GTR Bamboo or Carbon to be able to customize the way it performs much further. But when we look at the options that are available for the different gearing and toothing options for the Vestar Black Hawk, there are no options. It's what you see is what you get. Both of these boards are able to be converted over to street wheels, but it's again the same thing with the Vestar board where you only have the one option for the street wheel setup that you put on it. So there's no other gearing options that you can play with to increase your top speed or your torque. What you see is what you get. But again, with the Evolve GTR Bamboo and the Carbon, you've got the option to be able to switch between the two different options that Evolve offer as standard, and of course the endless options that you have from third-party manufacturers on the internet. And of course, there's pretty much endless different variations of wheel sizes that you can use with the Evolve boards when you're looking at street wheels, if it's the wheels that Evolve create themselves or the wheels that are able to be converted onto the Evolve setup from various different manufacturers out there. Now, when we look at the range that you can get on these different boards, when we start off with the Vestar Black Hawk, we managed to get roughly about 17 miles out of the board, and this is while the board was still in its fastest mode. It's important to mention that, of course, as the battery percentage dropped down, the top speed of the board also declined as well, as you would expect. But in terms of what we would consider rideable speed, 17 miles was what we were able to get out of the board before it dropped into a mode where it was riding at about 6 or 7 miles an hour, which we'll refer to as Vestar's version of eco mode. The mode on the remote doesn't actually switch from mode 3 to mode 2, but the speed, or the top speed of the board, drops dramatically after you've hit around 16 or 17 miles. When we look at this versus the Bamboo GTR with the 6-inch wheels, the range that we were able to get while we're still in GTR mode, still going full throttle, you're looking at about 14 miles. But after you cross that, the board is going to drop you into eco mode, and then you're doing about 11 miles an hour to be able to get you to where you're getting to. Now, surprisingly, you're still able to get maybe 3 or 4 miles out of the board. So if you consider these two different modes, the range that you're able to get out of them is very similar. When we look at the GTR Bamboo with the 7-inch AT wheels, the range that you get in GTR mode is about 16 miles before it kicks you into eco mode, where again you're able to get roughly about 2 to 3 miles on top of that, cruising at very slow speeds to get to your next charge point. Now, when we look at the acceleration of both of these boards, the Vestar with the 7-inch airless tyres versus the Evolve GTR Bamboo with the 7-inch tyres, the acceleration is very comparable, but in my opinion, the GTR Bamboo definitely had the edge on acceleration. If you're going 0 to say 15 miles an hour, 0 to 20 miles an hour from a dead start, the GTR Bamboo definitely had the edge over the Vestar with the 7-inch wheels, but only by a small margin. When we look at it with the 6-inch wheels, as you would expect, acceleration was much better on the GTR Bamboo.
3, 2, 1, go. Three, two, one, go.
But something that's important to mention is that the Vestarboard doesn't have an app like the Evolve GTR. When you go into the app and you're able to adjust the aggressiveness of the acceleration with the Evolve boards, Vestar can't do that. This is another area where it's very easy to be able to see why there's such a big difference between the two price points of these boards. When you adjust the acceleration on the Evolve board versus the Vestar, regardless of which wheel setup you use, whether it's the 7-inch or the 6-inch, it's going to have an edge over the Vestar. So that's definitely worth mentioning. Acceleration in general on the GTR Bamboo is much better than it is on the Vestar. Now, braking. Braking is definitely an important point. Now, when we look at braking on the Vestarboard, it's a bit of a strange one. Like with any board that you use, there's always going to be a learning curve because the way one board brakes versus another is going to be completely different. But when we're looking at the Vestar compared directly to the GTR Bamboo, braking was interesting. With the Vestar, essentially the faster you're going with the board, the softer the braking was the second you hit the brake at max braking. It was very, very soft, and as you started to slow down, the braking got more aggressive as it was braking, if that makes sense. But with the GTR Bamboo, when you slam on the brake, the faster you're going with the GTR Bamboos, the more aggressive the braking is. The slower you're going, the softer the braking is. So it means that essentially the Vestar's braking felt very sketchy at max speed because it was very soft, and as the board started to brake, the braking got greater and more intense. But on the other hand, the GTR Bamboo's braking was very intense as you brake at max speed, and as you continue to brake, it softens. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, but in my opinion, I definitely feel like the braking on the GTR Bamboo is safer than it is on the Vestar, as harsh as that is to say, because at the end of the day, if you're going 20 plus miles an hour on a skateboard, you want to be able to stop quickly. Whereas on the Vestar, it was very soft, and then as you slowed down, the braking got more intense. So essentially, there is a learning curve with any board that you use with how the braking works and how the braking performs. But in my opinion, if you're moving at 20 plus miles an hour, you want the board to stop sooner rather than later, and that's why I say that I felt that the Evolve GTR's braking was safer than the Vestar's. I'd rather the board stopped sooner, so the braking was very aggressive at the start, and as I slowed down, the braking got softer, versus the Vestar's braking, which is very soft at the beginning, and as you continue to brake, it gradually gets harder. Personal preference, but I thought I'd mention that. Bear in mind that anything that I share is based on my preference. Yours might be a little bit different. Let me know in the comment section what you think about these two braking options and which one fits better for your style of skating. So looking at both of the remotes for these boards, the Vestar's remote is very traditional to, if you're comparing it to what you typically see with boosted boards or even X-Way boards, where you have a scroll to be able to accelerate and you pull back to be able to brake. This board isn't like boosted boards where you accelerate and if you pull back, the wheels start going in reverse to send you going backwards. It just brakes. something I've got to mention is that it definitely brakes well, especially even if the board isn't moving. If you hold back on the brake, it does hold really well, which is something that a lot of boards that we've tried don't really do that well. Now when we look at the actual setup of the board, you can double click the options or the menu button on the board to be able to throw the board into backwards, or double click it to throw it into reverse. So when you scroll forwards, it'll either reverse or go backwards. And there's a little arrow on the LED screen to show you which direction you're going in. So when you accelerate forwards, the board doesn't throw you backwards unexpectedly. But aside from that, the only other thing that we've been able to find that you can do on the remote is switch between the 3 different speed modes that the board has, and that's pretty much it. And of course the LED screen on the remote shows you your top speed in kilometers per hour. Funny enough, we weren't able to figure out how to switch it to mph, in case anyone's figuring out if that was something that you can do. If you know how to, please leave it in the comment section down below. We're not being ignorant, we've just not been able to find it ourselves. But that's the kind of information that you can expect to get from the LED remote screen, as well as the board's life in terms of blocks, not percentage, and also the remote for the board's life as well by blocks, not percentage, in terms of how much battery life you've used. And aside from the remote having a trip counter, it also has an odometer so you can see exactly how much range the board has covered as a whole. But bear in mind, depending on which wheel setups you have and the diameter of the wheel, this isn't going to be 100% accurate, because we've not really been able to see anywhere in the settings that you can adjust which wheel setups you're using so you can have a more accurate reading. But this is definitely something that the Evolve boards lack, is having that total number of roughly how many miles the board has done in general. When we look at Evolve's remote, this is a completely different setup. It has a deadman switch, which is something that I definitely like to see on a remote. The Vestarboard doesn't have a deadman switch, so when the board is stationary, or if you happen to brush past the remote accidentally and you hit the accelerator, the board will go flying. A lot of people prefer to have a deadman switch, some prefer not to. I'm definitely in the category of people that like to have the deadman switch to be able to have a bit more control, in my opinion, over the way the board reacts and works, especially when you don't expect it to do anything. But the Evolve's remote is more of a trigger setup rather than a scroll wheel, which is completely different. Neither one is better than the other. If you prefer to have a deadman switch or not, then of course the Evolve one is going to be better for you. But in terms of the ergonomics of how it fits in your hand, it's going to come down to personal preference. But in terms of what the Evolve remote displays on the screen, it shows you, again, your top speed in kilometers or miles. You can switch through the settings on the Evolve remote. It also shows you the different setups that you have, depending on which wheels you go for. If it's street wheels, various different sizes, or AT wheels, 2 different sizes. It allows you to switch between the wheel setups and also the gear setups, so whatever reading you're getting on the remote screen is as accurate as it can be. Aside from this, it of course also shows you the battery percentage of the remote and also the battery percentage of the board itself. The board's percentage is in percent, and the board's remote battery life is displayed in bars. But unlike the Vestar's remote, with the Evolve remote you have a lot more buttons, so you're able to go through the settings and adjust various different things, the wheel setups, the gear setups, if you want it in miles or kilometers, if you want the deadman switch on or off. A lot more functionality in Evolve's remote versus Vestar's. Now, when you're looking at hill climbing with the Vestar versus the Bamboo GTR, in general, the Vestar's hill climbing ability was slightly better than the GTR's. There was definitely occasions that Ricky was able to pull away from me. He is a much lighter rider than myself, but we switched boards and did the same thing again, and we were level pegging until we got about halfway up the hill, and then the Vestarboard, regardless of who was on it, started to pull away again. Come a bit closer. 3, 2, 1, go. What's this car doing? It's the weight. No, no, no. Yep. But the Vestar, very, very surprisingly, etched out the Evolve GTR Bamboo, regardless of which wheel setup we had, when you're looking at hill climbing. So when we look at the general build quality of these two boards, now this is again where you're going to see a big difference because of the price and because of who's making these boards, the different manufacturers. This is where Evolve definitely takes the lead. Essentially everything on the Evolve board is custom made by Evolve. The trucks are forged, the Kingpin trucks are insanely good quality, the bushings are amazing, the way the battery enclosure is sealed is fantastic. You look at the Evolve board and you can see where your money is going. Everything feels and looks premium on it, even the thickness and the materials that the trucks themselves are constructed from. When we look at the Vestar, not to say that it looks cheap, but it definitely doesn't have that quality factor that the Evolve boards have. Even if you just look at the trucks in terms of the way they appear from a distance, Vestar's trucks are very, very thin, Evolve's trucks are incredibly thick. All of this is why there's such a big price difference between these two boards, and if it's something that's important to you, it's something that you need to consider. How much are you going to be using your board? What do you need it for? How reliable do you want all of the parts on it to be? How strong do you need them to be? This is something that you pay for. Very often in the world, you get the expression, you get what you pay for, and electric skateboards is no different. So that's not to say that the Vestarboard is bad quality, but the quality of the board, the materials that are used to construct it, even the deck itself, all of that is going to be reflected in the price that you pay for it. Now, when we talk about the ride, deck aside, construction of the boards aside, I'm going to touch on the wheels. 7-inch or 6-inch wheels with an inner tube versus 7-inch wheels with no inner tube makes a massive difference. The general ride when you're riding on the roads that we have around the UK, especially around Cambridge, it's very comparable. You don't really notice a big difference. It's only when you hit cobbled streets or very, very rough surfaces or loose surfaces like pebbles or gravel that you really see the difference. In slightly damp or slightly hazy conditions, the Evolve GTR with its inner tube wheels, 6-inch or 7-inch, has pretty much endless grip. But when you look at the Vestar's 7-inch wheels with no inner tube that are solid, the material that they've used or the rubber that they've used is fairly soft, but in comparison to a wheel with an inner tube, it's going to be solid. You find that if you really push the board out while you're carving, it is going to slide out. If you're riding on slightly less than desirable surfaces like cobbled streets or loose gravel, it is going to slide out a lot more than the wheel that has an inner tube inside it. So the ride on the Evolve GTR with the inner tube wheels is far better. Doesn't matter what you're riding on, especially if you're on the 7-inch AT wheels with the Evolve boards. You don't really have to think about it. Riding up and down curbs, cobbled streets, loose surfaces, you have so much more grip, so much more control than the Vestar. This is where the big difference in the way these two boards performs really stands out. The roads that we've been riding on haven't really been wet. They've been a couple of areas that have been slightly damp that we've been riding on today. And I found that while I'm carving on the Vestar, it's been great. But the second you hit a tiny bit of moisture, and I mean not even enough for the wheels to pick it up and throw it back onto your legs or your trousers or your shoes, whatever you're wearing, just a tiny amount of moisture on the surface, the wheels are sliding out. You don't have anywhere near as much control or confidence. But with the wheels that have inner tubes in them, 6-inch or 7-inch, this isn't even something you have to consider. My carving in the Vestarboard with the 7-inch wheels with no inner tube was definitely a lot more controlled, and I was a lot more apprehensive with my carving than I was riding down the same street on the same day at pretty much the same time with a wheel that had an inner tube inside it. And swiftly from there, moving on to the way the deck and the trucks and the bushings performed. The Vestar's trucks, deck and bushings felt a little bit more unpredictable when we VS'd them against the GTR Bamboos. Although both of these decks are flexy, the GTR Bamboo had a very stable feel. You kind of after a while know how it's going to react in different situations. Not 100%, but you get a really good feel of how far you can push the board before you lose control. This wasn't something that I felt in the Vestar with the way that the trucks and the bushings work. Regardless of how loose or how tight they were, they just felt a little bit more unpredictable, not in a bad way. If you've been riding the Vestar and it's the first kingpin truck, or rather double kingpin truck board that you've ridden while you're carving, while you're accelerating up hills, etc., it feels fine. But when you literally bounce from one to the other and then back to the other and keep doing that all day, it's when you can see the difference between the way these two boards perform and feel, clear as night and day. The Bamboo GTR felt much more stable, and I felt like I could push that a lot more aggressively and a lot more haphazardly than I could the Vestar. I can see one advantage to having a tyre with no inner tube with the Vestar set up with the 7-inch wheels that they have. You don't have to worry about making sure your air pressure is correct. You don't have to worry about flat tyres. But the compromise in the feel and performance of the board and the wheel doesn't really make sense for me. So I don't really understand why you'd pick an AT wheel that has no inner tube versus an AT wheel that has an inner tube. But saying that, if Vestar were to release a 7-inch or a 6-inch wheel that had an inner tube in it to combat these problems, it would improve the ride and the performance of this board massively. Again, something that's worth mentioning off of the way that the board performs with the wheels and the trucks and the bushings is, regardless of how tight we had the truck set up, the bushings that are on this board are just too soft. They need to introduce some options to be able to cater for light riders and heavy riders to aid the general performance and experience and feel that you get when you're riding their skateboards. This is exactly why you see companies like Evolve releasing a bushing kit that has a sick amount of options for you to be able to decide what kind of a ride you want. If you want slightly softer in the back, slightly stiffer in the front, they give you the option to be able to do that. And this is again where we see those margins in the price being justified based on the options, the customization, and what is available for one board versus another. So in summary, the Vestar Black Hawk with the AT wheels is a phenomenal board. For the money, for the spec that you're getting, the top speed, the carving, the range, all of that stuff is phenomenal on this board considering the price. But we do need to mention that we are comparing it to the GTR Bamboo, which is, in terms of premium, walking into a shop, buying a complete electric skateboard and walking out, there isn't really a brand, in our opinion, above this being the Evolve GTR. So bearing that in mind, comparing a Chinese board to a, I guess you could call it an Australian board, the benchmark has been set pretty high. But we've laid out all of the differences between these two boards, so you need to make the decision in terms of which one of these is going to be best for you based on the budget and the performance of the board. But all of the facts are in this video. Make up your mind and leave any comments down below on anything that you are unsure of or anything that you feel that we might have missed out in this video.